share her knowledge of Grace Julian Clarke. I know she has put a lot of work into this, and we are excited to hear what she has to say. Feel free to put any questions in the chat, and we will address those as she goes through her program or at the end. So Jackie, thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks, Anne. Thanks to everybody for joining. And if you were at the marker dedication this morning, thank you so much for coming out. I'm still feeling very excited about all of that, so thank you. Am I good to dive in, Anne? Anything else you wanted to run through? Okay, great. Well, thank you to the Irvington Historical Society and, like Anne said, Indiana Humanities and the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial Speakers Bureau. Thank you for requesting this talk. I'm really excited to bring what knowledge I have about Grace Julian Clarke to the public. The talk today, and let me share my screen before we get too far. Okay. Alrighty, there we go. Okay, so the talk today is the undefeatable Grace Julian Clarke. I actually pulled this from an article in the Rushville Republican, and the title of the article in that newspaper was "A Fight Seemed to Be Brewing." And I like that because it foreshadows a little bit of what we'll get into here in the beginning of this talk today. But before diving into the content, I did want to go over a few notes. So there we go. The talk today is a condensed version of my master's thesis, which I defended this past fall in September, I think it was, in 2019. The goal of my thesis was to analyze the correspondence of Grace Julian Clarke to see what her impact was during the time in which she lived. And what I ultimately concluded was that between the years of 1915 and 1920, she really emerged as a political actor through her activities. I think for the most part, anyone who knows Grace knows that she was a suffragist and many other things, but what I really saw was that she's a political actor. She was a politician in her own way. So the talk today is broken into 3 parts. We're going to first look at her state influence, and then we'll look at her national work, and then finish up with her international efforts. I'll also evaluate Clarke's relationship to and the influence that she got from her father, George Julian, and his work as a US congressman throughout each chapter and each section that we go through, because my thesis is also broken up into these 3 parts. And the goals for today, what I hope you'll find by the end is a common theme that she didn't give up even when she experienced what might be seen as failure, because she was not always successful in everything that she did, but it never stopped her, which ultimately led her to live a very successful life and what I see as a career. So she was essentially undefeatable at being defeated. Another note to mention before we begin, keep in mind that her privileged status allowed her to become a unique and notable voice for many women in Indiana. Not all women during this time had the same opportunity to do so. Socioeconomic factors like race and income and background, education, all of these things played into her ability to accomplish and do what she did. And lastly, while I hope you see that she was indeed a suffragist, she was much more than that, and I do believe she was a true political actor. And then a note on the resources that I pulled from to create this talk. My entire thesis relies heavily on those letters found in the Grace Julian Clarke collection. That collection's housed at the Indiana State Library, and it is huge. I barely made a dent in it, so I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, to go check that out and do some digging on your own. But keep in mind that the materials in the collection that this research is based on, those were all compiled by her. And from what I can tell, she really curated all of this information and donated it herself. All of the letters, scrapbooks, and other artifacts in the collection, she donated. And as my friend Stephen at the library pointed out to me, it's also important to remember that at some point when Clarke donated that collection, it also went through the hands of other people as well. And while I don't know anything about the particular archivist who was on staff and who processed her collection, it is important to remember that through that process, information could have been removed from her collection depending on the curator. And I say that because what's present in her collection is just as important as what's missing from it. You'll note that her work for women's suffrage in the African American community is not present here in my talk today. And while Grace did attend African American women's clubs and suffrage meetings, we know that she did because Dr. Anita Morgan uncovered that in her research. Evidence of that is not in Clarke's collection that I came across. Rather, you can find a lot of evidence of that in the work, or the evidence of her work in the newspapers. So I think it's compelling that Clarke, or the archivist who processed her collection, didn't feel a responsibility to collect or share that work to the effect that she did her other activities. And what I'm trying to emphasize there is that this talk today, even my thesis overall, is not a tell-all of Clarke's life. It's really intended to highlight her activities between 1915 and 1920 based on the sources in her collection. And as you'll see today, I do complement those letters with newspaper articles throughout, but at the end of the day, there's still a lot more research to be done to tell her entire story. So I like to start off with a very high-level overview, just to contextualize who she was as a person. Grace Julian Clarke is most notably remembered locally for her advocacy as a clubwoman, a journalist, and a staunch supporter of suffrage. But when it comes to her legacy at the national level, she does go largely unrecognized. She lived and she worked in Irvington, Indiana for most of her life, which was annexed by Indianapolis in 1902. And she attended Indianapolis public schools and graduated from Butler University with her BA and MA in philosophy. And as I'm sure you all know, Butler was located in Irvington at the time. She's the daughter of George Julian and the granddaughter of Joshua Reed Giddings, both of whom were leading abolitionists and members of Congress, US Congress. Laura Giddings, Clarke's mother, introduced Clarke to women's organizations when she helped to organize the Indianapolis Women's Club in 1875. And then Clarke went on to marry Charles B. Clarke. And prior to their marriage, Charles had actually worked very closely with her father as a US deputy surveyor in the New Mexico Territory. And in addition to practicing law, Charles also served in the Indiana Senate in 1913 and 1915. And as we'll talk a bit more about today, Grace was also a writer. She wrote for the Indianapolis Star from 1911 to 1929 and also authored 3 publications, all of which related to her father. So part 1, we're definitely going to focus more on her state influence here. And what I noticed in my research was that her influence at the statewide level grew in a pretty short span of time. In the years leading up to 1915, Clarke had made a name for herself at the local level, and there were people around the state who knew her by that time, but it didn't seem to be until really 1915 that she cemented her persona at the statewide level. Based on my research, I attribute that rise in recognizability to one main event, and that was the 1915 election for president of the Indiana Federation of Clubs. And if you're unfamiliar with that organization, the Indiana Federation of Clubs, it was essentially a chapter of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which was founded in 1890 during the Progressive Movement. It had over 3,000 clubs across the country who participated, and the Federation's overall goal was really to promote civic improvements through volunteer service at the local levels. And Clarke herself was actually a founder and an officer for the Indiana Federation of Clubs. So why talk about the 1915 election? When I started my research, I was really taken aback by the way that these women wrote to each other and talked to each other regarding this 1915 election. They were very direct with each other, very opinionated, and it was a lot of back and forth with each other to the point that these women were admittedly exhausted and completely drained by the whole experience. Their disagreements surrounding the election were really based on differences in individual opinion. So for me, one of the conclusions I drew was that the election demonstrated how in some instances, women got in their own way of progress in terms of gaining the right to vote, because they weren't always able to see or compromise beyond their immediate personal opinion and perspective, which no doubt that's a reflection of their privilege that they even had the ability to choose between the urgent cause for suffrage and their personal objectives. Women then, as they are today, are multifaceted, and they had a tendency to let their own personal preference win out over the betterment of the whole. And thus, ultimately, they failed to unite together a lot of the time. That's not true for all facets of the suffrage movement, but it did appear to be the case in this instance. And it could be partially why it took 69 years for women to win the vote in Indiana. Even more, the election of 1915 demonstrates that women involved in this election, they were not afraid to act unladylike with one another, particularly behind closed doors, but more notably in public spaces as well. And my full research dives into more of the grit and the nuance of this campaign and discusses some larger implications for the suffrage movement in Indiana. But for our purposes today, I'm going to focus primarily on Clarke's role in the election and how I believe it elevated her unique position within the state. So let's jump into some of the details of this election and discuss how it served as an impetus for Clarke to expand her influence. During 1915, Clarke, who you see on the far right of your screen, acted as a campaign manager for a Terre Haute woman named Lenore Hannah Cox, who is immediately to Clarke's left. Cox was a candidate for the president of the Indiana Federation of Clubs, and although Cox was later soundly defeated by her opponent, Carolyn Fairbank of Fort Wayne, who's on the top left of your screen, Cox's candidacy gained a lot of attention from club women and men all over the state. Clarke, in particular, detested Fairbank's campaign manager, Stella C. Stimson, who's on your bottom left screen. So just to recap that real quick, because it can get a little confusing, you have Grace Julian Clarke acting as the campaign manager for Lenore Hannah Cox, and you have Stella C. Stimson acting as the campaign manager for, I just blanked on her name, for Carolyn Fairbank. There it is. These women have very long names. But these are the women we're going to focus on throughout this election. And the reason why Clarke really detested Stimson was because of what Clarke viewed as unethical campaign practices. Stimson aggressively accused Cox of being a woman who did things like smoke cigarettes, supported a saloon because her husband was known to own property that operated as a saloon. And Stimson also said Cox was a woman who perpetually cursed, and she also accused her of being an atheist. And so these allegations against Stimson and others that were made against Cox, they might sound silly by today's standards, but the rumors did carry significant weight during the early 20th century, and they definitely speak to the norms of the time. A lot of reformers expected other reformers to maintain strict moral codes, and the allegations made against Cox suggested that she didn't. Clarke retaliated by spearheading a campaign against Stimson, stating both publicly and privately that Stimson was a liar, a cheater, and a morally corrupt woman based on her assault against Cox's character. And you can see the political cartoon on your screen here. I came across a few of these that I'll highlight, but this is how the election was being portrayed in the public. So why does it matter? Grace Julian Clarke was at the forefront of this political conflict, as was Stimson, even though neither woman was actually running for the candidacy themselves. And because of Clarke's influence, even as a campaign manager, the campaign demonstrates how she was beginning to develop her political skills prior to women gaining the right to vote. And before this election, Clarke may have been known around the state in circles of club women, but this event really catalyzed her into becoming a political actor, and she was able to gain the attention of men and women around the state through media. And Clarke definitely wasn't afraid to speak her mind about Stimson and the way that Stimson would badmouth Cox, and Clarke continued to do so throughout the campaign at a statewide level. But through this campaign, Clarke continued to back Cox loyally, even when the current president of the Indiana Federation, Vida Newsom, wrote to Clarke and warned her that she was on the wrong side of this debate. For Clarke, though, she really thought that a true woman was defined less by her private behavior and more by her public work. So she continued to back Cox. But the impact of the election was felt by women and men across the state. Like I said, you could see this being portrayed in local newspapers with political cartoons, such as the one shown here. It's showing these women obviously on different sides of the aisle, disagreeing with each other, calling each other names. What a week to talk about this, because I know we all can relate to that. with our current political landscape. But as we progress through her journey tonight, you'll see how her statewide credibility created opportunity for her beyond the campaign and at least through 1920. But to really understand the motives behind Stimson and Clarke, I do want to add a layer of historical context. In the years leading up to 1915, there was a growing discrepancy between temperance and suffrage motivations, with temperance groups fighting for the complete abstinence of liquor and suffragists fighting for the vote. Stimson was well known to be a, quote, anti-liquor enthusiast, while Clarke generally saw female independence as the preferred goal. Clarke believed that gaining female independence first would allow women the power to push for other reform efforts, including temperance, later. It was clear, though, that through correspondence, the temperance issue was at the forefront of this campaign, even if Clarke and others didn't want to admit it. And that demonstrates that the women involved, including Clarke, were motivated by their own personal ambition and experiences, and were pushing their individual goals of either temperance or suffrage within the Federation. Clarke's work during this campaign also reflects her strong desire to make women's suffrage the main priority, and I think a lot of that has to do with her father. And so throughout the research, I did analyze Clarke's possible ulterior motivations due to her father's prior work. Even Clarke explained her personal roots in a letter when she said, "My father had the honor of introducing the very first suffrage amendment in Congress shortly after the Civil War, which, owing to the exigencies of Reconstruction politics, was not pressed at that time. This is to show you why I cannot be a trimmer. I need not assure you that the thing I want above all others is that which will be the best for the great woman movement." So her father, U.S. Congressman George Washington Julian, he did become interested in women's rights around the same time that he adopted his abolitionist philosophy in the 1840s. And after helping to enact the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised African men, he proposed a constitutional amendment to Congress in 1868 that is widely believed to be the first women's suffrage amendment. And that's something that Clarke saw as, quote, another illustration of the prophetic quality of his mind and of his public efforts. Although the amendment was ultimately unsuccessful, the magnitude of his actions, I think, very likely compelled Clarke to follow in her father's political footsteps. But pivoting back to the election of 1915, Clarke had continued to give more and more speeches at meetings around the state in an attempt to gain support for Cox and also in an attempt to discredit Stimson. Clarke's influence did sway women to rethink their support, but it was not enough to change the vote in Cox's favor. Nonetheless, and perhaps more significantly for Clarke's personal career, her role as a loyal campaign manager earned her a lot of respect across the state. A fellow clubwoman wrote to Clarke regarding her significance, and she said, "You must know how you stand in the Federation. Your position reminds me of that of Jane Addams in the National Suffrage Organization. Whatever she says carries great weight, and whatever she champions wins all the state votes at once." This writer went on to say that when you get up and women who are new ask who it is, and they're told it's Mrs. Grace Julian Clarke, they are at once impressed because every last one of them knows who you are. So with such strong stature among women, it's hard not to question how and why Clarke failed to get Cox elected as president. Perhaps Clarke felt overly confident going into the campaign because of her statewide standing. Even if that were true, the pushback that she faced throughout the campaign definitely illuminated her blind spots. Another clubwoman wrote Clarke to accuse her of having lived a sheltered life where many of the ugly, repulsive things had been swept away from her. This woman further pled with Clarke that where friends had once put her on a pedestal and looked to her for guidance, Clarke was now facing a Federation crisis. Even Stimson wrote to Clarke, accusing her of obliviousness since she had lived in a small circle of fortunate, well-provided-for women and a few successful men. So Clarke did innocently try to back a cause and a candidate that she genuinely believed in. But as some women noted, Clarke may have been blinded by her privileged role in society. And although Clarke was ultimately unsuccessful in getting Cox elected as president, She really began to find her voice as a political actor through this experience. She stood for what she believed, she took part in speaking engagements around the state, she never backed down, and she made a name for herself by advocating for what and who she genuinely believed in. And the campaign also suggests that Clarke was heavily influenced by her father's advocacy of women's suffrage, and she may not have felt such a strong connection to her goals without that stimulus. But arguments and contests like this over issues that emerged from differences in personal circumstance, it demonstrates that women, including Clarke, disagreed over many things. And that fact would be true continuing into World War I, where women had to choose whether they wanted to focus on war-related work or to continue advancing the cause for suffrage. Which brings us to our next section, looking at her national work. So during the Federation campaign in 1915, much of the world had already found itself immersed in war. It wasn't until April 6, 1917, that the United States formally entered World War I. And that's when Americans started to really shift their priorities and their daily affairs. And that was true for all suffragists and club women, not only in Indiana, but the nation. And as the war began affecting Americans directly, suffragists found themselves at a crossroads. Should they continue fighting for the vote, or should they pause their efforts to focus their attention on assisting the home front? They ultimately chose to continue their fight by aligning their club efforts with patriotic duties. So they tried to do both at the same time. Clarke did acquire a very unique position among Hoosiers, especially Hoosier women, as she continued to write her weekly column. It was called Women's Clubs, and it ran in the Indianapolis Star. She also had a lot of other leadership opportunities that she seized at the onset of war. Her influence on women and their access to information was reflected in a letter to Clarke, which read, "You are a wholly worthwhile sort of person that everything you say and do is of value to me to know." Women around Indianapolis and across Indiana, they read Clarke's Sunday column, and it wasn't just because they were interested in clubs and what the club women were doing, but it was also because Clarke was writing them, and she had a lot of fans. And with the onset of war, she did, like I said, assume a lot of other leadership roles in the community. She volunteered to lead a sign-up station for the Red Cross at the Irvington Post Office. She also introduced a resolution at a meeting that was held at the YWCA in Indianapolis, where she urged local women to pledge to do their part in war relief work and to encourage others to do the same. After Clarke's address at that meeting, about 400 women registered their intent to take part in war relief work. And by May 1917, Clarke had been appointed by Marie Edwards, the president of the Women's Franchise League of Indiana, to supervise the Women's Franchise League war work. Another interesting leadership role that Clarke found herself in involved speaking out regarding the Library War Fund. That was a massive volunteer effort to raise funds and collect reading materials for American soldiers in camp libraries at home and abroad. So Clarke really saw value in maintaining normalcy for victims of war and helped to organize that effort to provide American soldiers with an escape. And during this time, Clarke also urged the immediate consolidation of the Indiana Women's Franchise League and the Indianapolis Equal Suffrage Association. The idea to make one suffrage association in the state, although it never actually came to fruition, it was in accordance with the United States Council of National Defense. Basically, Clarke believed that there was power behind numbers and that the consolidation of women both locally and nationally had a greater impact for the general cause of womanhood. In October of 1917, Clarke expanded her statewide influence by joining an Indianapolis organization of 14-minute women who spoke before clubs, church societies, and other organizations of women for about 14 minutes on the subject of food conservation. This organization was one wing that the local branch of the United States Food Administration, which was led by future President Herbert Hoover at the time, expected to share important facts regarding food conservation. So that was really the goal behind these talks. And the 14-minute women often worked with 4-minute men who also talked about food conservation but only for 4 minutes, which I think is kind of funny. And members of the 14-Minute Women included other locally prominent women, and their speaking tours helped to develop their public speaking skills at hundreds of gatherings throughout the war. In January of 1918, the 14-Minute Women were enlisted in state service after their effort had been found to be so effective that it was deemed advisable to enlarge and expand it. And that expansion included training for all speakers to talk about activities that were expected of women to help aid in the war effort. So Clarke and others received unique training and experience in public speaking throughout that process. It's worth emphasizing that public speaking was not a common skill for women to have at that time, and the experience in that training helped to further elevate her public persona, and she became increasingly recognized. She also became increasingly influential, and she became in very high demand regarding national topics and speakers being requested to speak for those things. By adhering to national requests for women to do things like conserve, consolidate, and advocate, Clarke also saw the opportunity to demonstrate a patriotic spirit that she felt would serve the Women's Club's reputation well. Clarke saw patriotic activities as a calculated move to garner trust from the federal government and earn credit. That credit, she believed, would later become politically useful when demanding the vote from Congress. At the onset of war, Clarke quickly supported President Woodrow Wilson and his war-related policies, although it did garner some concern from her confidants. One woman wrote to Clarke and said, "I want you to be careful. You are young yet, and I would love to see you where your father sat, in the House." Although Clarke never publicly expressed interest in elective office that I had come across, Clarke eagerly participated in and supported the war effort where and when she could. So much so that it may have been done without sufficient forethought about her future. Women's actions during this time would mean a great deal for the future of women in politics, and women in leadership roles like Clarke had to remain calculated and one step ahead in order to retain their respected positions. The woman who wrote to Clarke further warned her that women take politics by tradition, the great mass of them, and are woefully content at present just so, minus information. So this is one example of recognition that Clarke received regarding being strategically well-informed where perhaps other women were not. Clarke's position as a valuable source of political information was not only a result of her direct engagement in politics, but it does, again, also reflect her ongoing dedication to fulfilling her father's legacy. Throughout the war, Clarke processed her father's political papers in an effort to document his work sort of as a side project to everything else she had going on. She was particularly interested in her father's role during the Civil War, which makes sense given that Clarke herself found the country living in a time of war as well. Nonetheless, I do believe Clarke's father's work continually inspired her to fulfill his legacy. And to do so effectively, Clarke herself had to stay informed about political happenings, both historic and new. And she worked tirelessly to educate women so that they could be equally informed as men. Rather than blindly following the masses during a time when many women were eager to jump feet first into supporting the war effort, Clarke as a leader had to remain on top of the ever-changing political arena. The stakes for doing so were really high since women's enfranchisement depended on it. Clarke's department in the Indianapolis Star began publicizing club efforts related to the war, with the Indianapolis News doing the same soon after. And since Clarke was the primary person sharing these efforts with the media, you could say that she strategically used the war as a mechanism to further spread information about suffrage and other club happenings around the state, which made the groups more approachable and interesting to outsiders. And as the Federation and its activities gained more and more traction in the media, more prominent individuals on the national level began looking toward Indiana and looking toward Clarke. So much so that Clarke herself received an invitation from national leaders to attend the Win the War for Permanent Peace Convention. That convention outlined the mission and the work of the League to enforce peace. In addition, she garnered an invitation to the Allied War Dinner that concluded the convention. That dinner is where representatives of the Allied nations would speak, including representatives from the US, France, Canada, and Great Britain. So during World War I, Clarke found herself on the national and even international stage, giving war-related appearances and speeches, not just to women's clubs as she did during the 1915 election. And because Clarke and other women pivoted their efforts toward war work during this time, women across the nation and in Indiana, regardless of affiliation, urged Congress to grant suffrage as a war measure. Marie Edwards, who was also the president of the Women's Franchise League in 1918, argued that winning the war was the League's immediate need and that winning it would guarantee suffrage. Clarke, supporting Edwards' position on that, argued another reason for consideration of suffrage as a war measure is found in the fact that while we are sending millions of our young men across the water to fight for democracy and civilization, being thereby deprived of their votes in important elections here at home, we yet permit millions of pro-Germans to exercise this function. We are too suspicious of the latter to allow them to work in munition plants, yet we calmly behold them voting for mayors, governors, judges, and members of Congress. Actually decided the elections in many places while American women, wives and mothers of those splendid young men over in France, sit bound, but thank heaven, not dumb, witnesses of this infamy. So the war had illuminated women's ability to use genuine patriotism as a political tactic to achieve the vote through club and suffrage work. The war also brought about increased involvement in public activity, although it was at the expense of suffrage work. However, women, they did not always put their work on pause completely, and that can be noted by Clarke's continued political leadership, her journalistic efforts, and her increasingly larger and larger influence. One woman praised Clarke in regard to her weekly column when she said, quote, "It reviews the efforts of the forward-looking women of Indiana and so ably makes clear that the great achievement of today was made possible by the unfailing courage of the pioneer who blazed the trail. I know how earnestly you have aided this great cause and how you have dignified its promotion." Clarke's actions do demonstrate that even though women were challenged during a time when they were so close to achieving the suffrage goal that they had been working on for nearly a century, they did simultaneously stay loyal to their country and their womanhood. And Clarke herself explained, "We women are truly patriotic, not only by knitting and doing the conventional kinds of war work, but by the utmost exertions to secure for the women of our country their rightful place as equal partners in the tremendously important enterprise of government. Women of all religious denominations, club women, women who work whether in the home or in the many fields outside, young women and old, colored women and white, all women with sufficient wit to discern right from wrong, daylight from night, should enlist in the present suffrage drive." So some takeaways from this national section. Women stayed loyal to both their country and their womanhood, which garnered them the vote in 1920. Clarke also expanded her persona to the national level during the war and kept Hoosier women informed about national politics through her newspaper column. Although women had finally attained the vote, it wouldn't be the end of Clarke's political career. Her interests were beginning to expand beyond national politics during the war, and her confidence as a political influencer grew as well, and she started to set her eyes on larger international affairs, specifically Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. So just to recap before we go into this final section here, prior to World War I, Clarke focused her political efforts at the state level. Those efforts included campaigning for Cox's presidency, as well as for local politics that affected the family. But during World War I, she turned her focus primarily to efforts at the national level through patriotic activities. By the time the war ended, she had helped convince a lot of people that women were worthy of being included in national political conversations through her newspaper column and through her own war work. With the end of the war in sight, Clarke did start to turn her attention toward those international affairs, especially as it related to the League of Nations, which was the first worldwide intergovernmental organization whose mission was to maintain world peace. I'll keep it simple and keep it there. It's much more complicated than that, but that's what we need to know for the talk today. It wasn't long until Clarke began receiving new requests to speak at clubs around the state regarding the League. Other women who were asked to travel for speaking engagements often faced a choice of family or work, but since Clarke was married to an established attorney and she didn't have children of her own, she had more privilege and freedom to pursue these kinds of opportunities, and she absolutely did. Because this part of Clarke's life has so much to do with the League of Nations, I do want to provide some context behind that. According to historian David M. Kennedy, the idea of the League of Nations was discussed extensively prior to 1918 when it was made part of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The 14 points were intended to be the basis for negotiating peace at the end of the war, and progressives often endorsed the League, but others saw the covenant as controversial, really as a controversial expansion into international politics. The League was attached to the Treaty of Versailles, which is what formally ended World War I, and it was presented to the US Senate by Woodrow Wilson in 1919. The covenant, however, was not easily understood by most. Historian Ellis W. Hawley describes the League as an organization that would function through two major organs, an assembly made up of all members, and a council consisting of the major powers as permanent members and 4 smaller nations chosen by the assembly. And at the heart of the organization would be a mutual guarantee by all members of each other's independence and territorial integrity. So the League, as Hawley explained, it would not have an army or a police force of its own, but the countries belonging to the League of Nations might be called upon to take militaristic action in cases of aggressions by any foreign country that threatened world peace. And so for that particular reason, Wilson's League could not come without some controversy around it. Nonetheless, Clarke received a lot of praise for successfully introducing the Club Women of Indiana to the League to Enforce Peace as the precursor to the League of Nations. For her, she felt that provoking club women to study components of it would lead them to actively support it. After the war ended, Clarke continued to receive requests to speak on behalf of ongoing political issues because A, her ability to remain available for the work, and B, because she was so well informed on current events like the League of Nations. So by this time, women all over the state, they really trusted Clarke, and they trusted to be able to turn to her to learn more about the current political landscape. According to Clarke, women felt that approving the League would move society toward a world understanding and world peace that had been the dream and the desire of the most enlightened men of all generations. Women wanted the covenant adopted because they believed in democracy, in the home, and in all sanctities of life. Above all, though, Clarke really wanted Indiana's place in this matter to be, quote, in the sun when the final record was made up. And so in order for that to happen, Clarke recognized that even a small step forward in a world peace covenant required a tremendous vote in the Senate. She wrote one of the state's US senators, Harry S. New, encouraging him to support the League. She pled with him and said, in the name of the women of Indiana, who constitute one half of its citizenship, in the name of that patriotism which knows no party when questions of humanities are involved, I respectfully beg that you will give the League of Nations covenant your hearty support. Other prominent women, however, wrote to Clarke admitting that they did not know much about the League of Nations or the League to Enforce Peace, but that they supported their general ideas. Although women tried to keep up to date with global politics, it was often difficult to stay informed of changes in a timely manner. This was during an era when instant communication was non-existent, and it often took days, if not weeks, to correspond or receive news. So women found themselves lacking enough information to confidently support national and international affairs. And a friend of Clarke's perfectly illustrated that mix of confusion when she signed this letter you see on the screen to Clarke. She signed it, "I am yours, somewhat chaotically, but affectionately." And I think that's how we're all signing off on every email in 2020. So women, they did not correspond about foreign affairs. And when they did correspond about foreign affairs, but when they did, they typically used very uncertain language. There would be some references to the European question or the Russian situation. So this really vague language talking about these current events. And that kind of ignorance of what was happening in the world really made it difficult for women to form educated opinions and prevented women from supporting the League wholeheartedly. And as news regarding the League became more and more complex and difficult for anyone to fully understand, Clarke was increasingly speaking up on its behalf publicly. By 1920, Clarke's name had been printed in newspapers across the state, and her face was prominently publicized too. John Holtzman of the Democratic State Central Committee in Indianapolis said that it had become a, quote, everyday matter to have demands for Clarke's picture. And so he wanted to have photos to be able to distribute, similar to like a contemporary headshot or a business card today. He wanted those so that he could circulate them wherever she spoke. One such speaking occasion was the Democratic County Tour, which was described as a political drive conducted solely by women, with 3 squadrons of automobiles, 4 cars each, carrying Democratic women workers around the county. Clarke was a headliner for that, alongside other prominent women in the state. And by the end of the tour, Clarke had spoken in front of about 800 people. The League of Nations ultimately became a point of controversy between political parties, particularly in regard to Article 10 of the League Covenant, because it had a pledge to protect the independence of all members with military force. And so many Americans saw Article 10 as constituting a blank check to use American military power, and really viewed that as a surrender of sovereignty and contradicting the US Constitution, which the Constitution states that only Congress can declare war. After women won the right to vote and the war had ended, women largely began aligning themselves with political parties based on their personal political views, rather than as a unified bloc. In the early days of suffrage, many women aligned themselves with the Republican Party since it had been more inclined to support women's rights. But that changed after women started to feel frustrated because ratification took so long, and many women blamed the Republican Party's inability to move women's interests forward. Clarke, too, at this time was beginning to favor Democratic legislation, and that could be why she so aggressively supported Wilson and the League. Some women condemned women like Clarke, who claimed to be Republican but declared themselves in support of Democratic policy. One woman criticized Clarke, stating, "You are a traitor, not only to the Republican Party, but also to your country when you declare yourself for a League of Nations. I am convinced you have not studied the situation carefully. You have merely accepted these men's views." Clarke still felt very compelled to speak on behalf of what she advocated for in an effort to garner new supporters for the League, but her efforts were definitely challenged at times, as you see here. Questioning her credibility, one male correspondent wrote to Clarke and said, "I would sure like to know how Grace, away out here in the woods of Indiana, happens to know more about this question, which is a mighty big one, than the persons themselves who invented it." Clarke garnered further criticism in one letter, and if you were at the dedication this morning, you heard Dr. Anita Morgan share this, but she did receive a letter with a simple message, handwritten, that said, "Madam, you are a damned fool." Regardless, Clarke continued to promote the League as a body that would promote better working conditions for all. Clarke's switch to favor Democratic policies were largely correlated with her League of Nations support and her efforts there. In 1920, she was asked to be one of 4 women to join a men's committee of 5 to meet the party's vice presidential candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, for dinner. Clarke was even asked later to go to the Indiana Democratic Club to meet Roosevelt at the station and pick him up upon arrival. And so the Democratic Party really recognized Clarke's value as she publicly advocated on behalf of their policies. Clarke was even recruited for rebuttal as needed when opponents publicly spoke against the League. So by this time, Clarke was perceived as having real public influence and was trusted with select insider information. She did get some insider information, I'll mention here too, about some of the presidential candidates. In the letters that I came across, they didn't divulge what that information was, but it was clear that at some point someone was giving Clarke some ammunition, if she needed it, to talk about publicly and discredit the politicians that she was pushing back against. But outside of the League of Nations, Clarke she continued to flex those political muscles that she had built up over time in other ways. After women won the right to vote, Clarke began co-authoring a Women in Politics column that ran every Sunday in the Indianapolis Star. And the column was intended to set out the activities of women as new voters from both the Democratic and Republican perspectives. And Clarke, she represented the weekly Democratic viewpoint. So by this time, she publicly declared herself a Democrat. And then Mrs. Joseph B. Keeling presented the Republican view. Clarke received a lot of letters from fans of her father and friends of her father as she became increasingly known. One reader drew comparisons to her father, stating, "It seems to me I can hear your father speaking through your pen, his wide-eyed vision of the main issue, his blazing devotion to the right, firmly choked down to a moderation of statement emphasizing rather than weakening the force of the conviction behind it." So friends of Clarke's father, they further reminded her, quote, "You know what a bold, daring, unflinching man your father was," end quote. So Clarke definitely learned from her father boldness and strength and saw the League as a truly humane policy that she needed to defend because of its core goodness. So Clarke, she had been passed down what one acquaintance called halo of inheritance from her father. And both her and her father's generations noted the similarities between their work. Without that significant and national scope of her father, I don't think Clarke would have been able to, or I don't think she would have been distilled with the knowledge and the confidence and the humanitarianism that advanced her own work and reputation. Although her father was a true Republican, the values which he bestowed upon her continued through her work, regardless of her political party affiliation. As for the League Covenant that Clarke had spent much of her post-suffrage career advocating for, the Senate chose not to join the League of Nations due to a lack of revisions regarding Article 10. Nonetheless, Clarke's determination, her passion, and belief in the League of Nations granted her a lot of new opportunities to assist the Democratic Party. In September of 1920, Clarke helped organize Indiana's division of a nationwide campaign for presidential candidate James Cox and running mate Franklin Roosevelt. The plan allowed leading women to carry the election efforts within their own state. Clarke also continued to work with the newly organized League of Women Voters of Indiana, but beyond 1920, Clarke devoted a lot of her efforts and attention to the people and the things that she cared deeply about, and she focused primarily on her community of Irvington. She also went on to serve as a member of the Old Marion County Board of Charities and the City Plan Commission, and also headed Indianapolis's first employment office under the appointment of President Woodrow Wilson. And she was also part of a commission that chose the names of authors to be engraved on the outer frieze of the Indianapolis-Marion County Public Library. After years of poor health, Clarke, she did ultimately pass away in her Irvington home in 1938 at 72 years of age. And at a meeting of the Indianapolis Women's Club, she was memorialized for her role in shaping women into political beings. Newspapers across the state also mourned her death, with the Indianapolis Star noting that, quote, "a torchbearer has fallen by the wayside." So some takeaways here. Clarke was unique in her ability to speak out for her own values, likely in large part due to the influence of her father. She was far from a bystander. And she engaged in political wars at the state level way before women had the right to vote. She was then immediately active beyond the typical Red Cross work at the onset of World War I. And by the time the League of Nations Covenant was being disputed at the national level, Clarke was already corresponding with national leaders to coordinate speaking events of her own around the state. She became more exclusive in these engagements, as there were very few women who actually understood the covenant well enough to speak out on its behalf. Clarke also differentiated herself from other women by becoming a politician rather than a reformer. Even though she never ran for political office herself, she was indeed a political actor in the sense that she directly impacted campaign outcomes and influenced legislative discussions. And although seemingly defeated at face value at times, she remained undefeatable by continuing to advocate for what she believed in. She did fail to elect Cox as the president. She did fail to consolidate women's organizations within the state, and the US didn't join the League of Nations. But she continued to advocate for her beliefs, the beliefs that she felt so strongly about based on her ethics and her morals that were instilled in her by her father, and she never let anything stop her. In fact, I believe that she used each opportunity as a tool to catalyze her into the next activity. And then lastly, examining activities of women like Clarke at the individual and local levels, it provides a more accurate, inclusive narrative of the suffrage movement and women's political action in the United States. We really need to find additional ways to better support research on women's history in Indiana before, during, and after the ratification of the 19th Amendment in order to have the whole story. So I do want to mention, I removed a lot of the technical references today to make the talk feel a little bit more approachable. But if you want to learn more or reference any of the research, you can find my master's thesis on IUPUI ScholarWorks. Just note that the title is different from the talk here today. It's titled Grace Julian Clarke, The Emergence of a Political Actor, 1915 to 1920. And I need to update this slide now. In previous talks, I always wanted to highlight that there would be a dedication for a historic marker planned for November 7th. But as I'm sure you all know, it's there. I don't need this fill-in picture of Zerelda Wallace anymore because the Clarke marker is there. So if you were not there this morning, do go by and check it out, the Julian House on Ottoman. It was a really wonderful morning, and I'm just feeling very grateful for everyone's support for the marker. Obviously, Grace had a lot of friends. And I'll go ahead and stop there. I just wanted to say thank you so much for showing up. It's a beautiful day outside, so I appreciate you spending some time on the computer with me today to learn about Grace Julian Clarke. If there are any questions in the chat, Anne, I can go ahead and answer some, or if not, that's okay too.
Jackie, thank you so much for sharing all that. Yes, and thanks to everyone for joining us here. This is your opportunity to type your questions into the chat, and then Jackie will be able to answer those. While you're thinking about your questions or typing those for a minute, also note that this presentation was recorded and soon will be available on the Irvington Historical website for other viewing. And we are also hosting the temporary exhibit, Securing the Vote, Women's Suffrage in Indiana. It is there through December 6th, so you may visit us Saturdays and Sundays from 1 to 4 p.m. while wearing your mask. Also, check us out on irvingtonhistorical.info and our Facebook page for other upcoming events or other information, other videos you might want to watch. And remember that you can help support the Irvington Historical Society by joining or renewing your membership. I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat.
You're welcome. Thank you all for listening. It's a lot of information, so you can always reach out to me, email or whatever else, and we can chat more later if you have questions that come up later.
All right, well, thank you. We have a last question. Grace was an officer of one of our major national suffrage groups. Is that correct? And can you speak more to that?
I'm going to be completely honest and say that I don't feel confident enough to say one way or the other. She was involved in so many different groups that, some existed for a short period of time, others long. I really focused heavily just on her individual experiences, less about her relationship to different organizations. I will plug Dr. Anita Morgan's book because I have a feeling she would know and it'd probably be in there, but I don't want to say for sure. She was definitely associated with NASA. I don't know for sure if she was an officer. And NASA being the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was definitely a member there. She had a role. I can't remember the specific role. So that could be what you're thinking of. So that might give you something to look more into if you look up NASA and her role there.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy this beautiful day.
Yes.